Hey guys, welcome back to another Genshin guide. Today we're going to talk about Keqing, a very strong, agile, and versatile character. We'll go over how to play Keqing, her best weapons, artifacts, team comps, deciding between Electro and physical Keqing, and her constellations. I highly recommend watching the beginning of this video to learn some basic and advanced tips on how to use her, especially if you've never played her before, but feel free to use the timestamps for your own needs. So yeah, let's get started. First, let's talk about her talents. Her 5-hit attack sequence is a standard 3-hit combo, followed by a 4th hit that's a flip that hits twice, and she vanishes for a short period. For her 5th hit, she reappears and charges in with some delay at the end. Because of so much delay, it's usually not worth going for the last hit. You want to first learn how to optimize her 4-hit combo and cancel her vanishing animation. You can do this by dashing, using your elemental skill, using your elemental burst, jumping, and switching out to another character. Don't dash too much though, because you need stamina for charge attacks, and jumping is good when you're out of stamina, even though it kinda looks funny. However, if you do commit to the last 5th hit for faster DPS, you can either dash out, use an elemental skill or burst, switch to another character, or jump. Next, you want to learn how to do charge attack spams. It's a very strong attack sequence that makes her a very viable DPS. After her first attack, hold down attack to do a charge attack, and hold down attack right after a charge attack to repeat the process. Practice the timing or you'll get stuck in her charge attack animation. You can repeat this process over and over until you run out of stamina. Also note that you do get pushed back like this when fighting smaller, non-stationary enemies. It's the most effective used on bosses, larger enemies, or even frozen ones, who don't go flying away and keeps Keqing in place. For smaller enemies, it's most effective as a finisher or you have to chase after them when they go flying. But if you do hit them, follow it up with an elemental skill, or immediately dash after the charge attack to chase them. But to save stamina, you can do a charge attack while holding forward and jump. Charge attack spams will drain your stamina, so make sure to spend it carefully as you need to dash and avoid enemy attacks as well. When you are low on stamina, I recommend this 4-hit combo followed up by a charge attack since the sequence refills some stamina. You can also follow up with an elemental skill, burst, jump, or switch to another character instead. Next is her elemental skill. Keqing will throw out a lightning stiletto that does minimal initial damage, and if you press your elemental skill again, you will teleport to that point. In combat, this will be auto-aimed. You can hold down your elemental skill so that you can aim it anywhere, and you can follow it up with either a plunge attack or glide. And for fun, you can also do a double plunge attack, like this. Now for the important part. Once you teleport to your stiletto, her first passive talent allows you to infuse your attacks into electro damage, and lasts for 5 seconds, so you need to keep using your elemental skill for optimal DPS for Electro Keqing. But her skill cooldown is 7.5 seconds, so there's a 2.5 second downtime where she can't do optimal DPS. But remember, her passive talent only activates once you teleport to your stiletto, and the 5-second timer starts then. So to avoid this 2.5 second downtime and optimize her DPS, you can do 2 techniques. You can throw out her stiletto first and then use her elemental burst, and then press your elemental skill again. This will ensure you have 100% uptime with your electro infusion. You can also throw out your stiletto and switch to another character. This works great with animal characters with a 4-piece Viridescent set to lower enemies' electro resistance. And you can combine both techniques for greater results with your Keqing. For physical Keqing, just press your elemental skill once to create elemental reactions like superconduct and then start attacking right away. You don't want to teleport with her. Just a side note, if you throw out stiletto and you use a charge attack, the stiletto will do some minimal electro AoE damage. I don't recommend using this for electro Keqing, but for physical Keqing it will help with elemental reactions. For electro Keqing, you could mess around with it though. Have fun and get creative with her elemental skill. It's great for exploration for gliding, climbing, dashing, hitting enemies that are up high that are usually out of reach, dodging enemies' attacks, partially disabling ruin guards if you hit above their heads, popping abyss mage bubbles, and more. Finally, her elemental burst. Keqing will disappear and start with an initial slash, followed by 8 consecutive slashes with a final slash at the end. The AoE is pretty wide and it's great to use when there are a lot of enemies. It has a cooldown of 12 seconds and a very low energy cost of 40. It's great for invincibility or iframes to avoid taking damage when she vanishes during it. It can reach some enemies that are high up as well. Another tip is that she can reappear faster if you quickly attack, dash, jump, use your elemental skill, or switch out characters. And as mentioned before, make sure to use your elemental skill and then your burst and elemental skill again for optimal DPS. With her second passive talent, you can use her elemental burst and increase your crit rate and energy recharge by 15% for 8 seconds, so it's ideal that you use your burst as soon as you can. This will be especially important for physical Keqing as they use her burst mainly for the crit rate, iframes, and for elemental reactions, not the damage. Now for talent prioritization. For Electro Keqing, focus on leveling her auto attacks and elemental burst equally. If you're swapping out often or using her more for her burst, level her burst first. Prioritize her elemental skill last. In my opinion, I wouldn't go past level 8 with it. Charge attacks and her burst are more valuable for Keqing. For physical Keqing, you want to prioritize your auto attacks as much as possible. You can keep your elemental skill and burst at level 6 max. I really appreciate you watching the video up until now. If you're liking the content so far, please make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. It will make me and Keqing very happy. Now for the weapons, I'll be making tier lists that are ordered based on each weapon's damage output, usability, and subjective claims. I will link more resources that explain refinements in detail in the description below. The new best in slot is the Jade Cutter, so if you pull this recently from the weapon banner, you're in luck. It gives you an insane amount of crit rate of 44.1% at level 90. With this, you can build your Keqing much easier than the other swords by stacking crit damage. Its passive gives you an attack bonus based on 1.2% of your max HP. Compared to the Summit Shaper, the damage is relatively close, but the Jade Cutter is never conditional, as the Summit Shaper requires a shield most of the time to do the most damage. The Summit Shaper was the former best in slot, and rightfully so. Its secondary stat is attack percent, which is much better for Electro Keqing than Aquila Favonia's physical damage bonus. And the Summit Shaper will outdamage the Aquila by quite a bit. You get more attack bonuses while protected by a shield, so it will be great with a team that uses shields. Aquila Favonia was the original best in slot for Electro Keqing when the game was first released. However, it's being beaten out by other new 5-star weapons. The physical damage bonus doesn't really do anything, but the high base attack of 674 at level 90, the 20% attack increase, and AoE aura that does a good chunk of damage, and the healing make up for it. It is still an amazing sword, so I still recommend it if you don't have the other 5 stars mentioned before. It's also very versatile as you can switch from Electro to physical as long as you have an artifact set for physical use. The Battle Pass Black Sword is a great sword on Keqing, so I had to put it in S tier. Although it doesn't do as much damage as the Jade Cutter and Summit Shaper, its crit rate secondary stat, boosting damage to normal and charge attacks, and healing from its passive makes this the best 4-star weapon for Electro Keqing. The crit rate substat also makes building your Keqing a bit easier. The Black Sword with more refinements doesn't fall too behind with the Aquila Favonia either. Also worth mentioning, you can also switch between physical and Electro Keqing as long as you have the physical artifacts with this weapon. In A tier, I put Lion's Roar because it actually does some insane damage, and at higher refinements, it will even beat out the Aquila Favonia. But it is a very conditional sword, so I can't justify putting it in S tier. Its passive gives you a 20% overall damage bonus increase against enemies affected by Electro and Pyro. At refinement 5, it gives you a 36% damage bonus, which is insane. However, there are enemies in this game that simply cannot be affected by Electro, such as the animal hypostasis and certain slimes, so the damage bonus would not work at all, and you would do very little damage. Also, if you're running a 4-piece Thunder Silver set, your entire build would become useless against these enemies. If you are a dedicated Keqing main and you have this sword at high refinements, I suggest keeping it, but also have a backup sword in hand. The Blackcliff Longsword is a very strong weapon, with a secondary stat being crit damage. However, the passive is just too conditional to use optimally in my opinion. You need to kill an enemy in order to get an attack increase of 12% for 30 seconds, which you can have up to 3 stacks by the way. This does not work for bosses, and during Spiral Abyss, a lot of the times you'll find yourself with 0 or 1 stack, especially with the new 1.3 floor 12. I think there are just too many other sword options you can work with, but if you only have a prototype Rancor is when I would recommend it. The Flute is a good option for Keqing. Its secondary stat is attack percent, and its passive provides some good AoE damage with its harmonics. Since Keqing attacks so quickly, you'll be proccing its passive pretty often. At higher refinements, it does even more damage. However, if you can invest in the Black Sword, I would still go for it, but not the Blackcliff Longsword. Finally, for the Prototype Rancor, I would only use it if it's the only sword you have in this tier list. Its physical damage secondary stat doesn't really help Electro Keqing. It has a good passive to increase normal and charge attacks at best. But if you can comfortably invest in the Black Sword, feel free to do so. Now for physical Keqing. I won't be repeating too many of the things I already mentioned from the previous tier list. This is where Aquila Favonia finally shines. Its physical damage secondary stat is actually amazing here. Her AoE also will do more damage and will help outdamage the other swords. The Jade Cutter and Summit Shaper don't fall too far behind, especially when you can't prod Aquila's passive though. The Jade Cutter again is great for the crit rate secondary substat, so it'll be easier for you to build Keqing and stack crit damage, and it doesn't fall too much behind the Aquila Favonia either. Summit Shaper is still really good as long as you're shielded to compete with Aquila and the Jade Cutter. The Black Sword again as mentioned is still very good, but it will lose out to Prototype Rancor as it gets more refinements. The crit rate and heals are something to consider, but it has a bit of trouble if you're going up against a Refinement 5 Prototype Rancor. This is also where Prototype Rancor finally shines. It's actually a very good weapon for any sword user that does physical damage. It will outdamage the Black Sword at higher refinements and with its passive stacks. You most likely will have a Refinement 2 Prototype Rancor also, so if you don't have any other sword, you are still set as physical Keqing. The Flute will fall off as physical Keqing. It's still a decent option with some AoE damage, but I just recommend going for Prototype Rancor. The physical damage bonus is just too valuable on that weapon. Now for artifacts. For early mid-game artifacts, just keep it simple and don't go out of your way to farm specific sets. For Electro Keqing, an overall build I recommend is any 2-piece 18% attack bonus set such as Gladiators, Sojourners, or Braveheart, plus 2-piece Berserkers. Although crit rate isn't as useful in early game, it's an artifact that's readily available and still gives you a good damage boost. For physical Keqing, I recommend 2-piece martial arts set plus 2-piece Berserkers. If you're extremely lucky with a 4-piece martial arts set with the correct main stats, use that instead. If you don't have a 2-piece martial arts set, you can just use a 2-piece Gladiator, Sojourners, or Braveheart. Now for the main stats early game. For the timepiece you want attack percent, either an Electro or physical damage bonus cup, depending on your Keqing playstyle, and an attack percent for early mid game is okay, crit rate or crit damage headpiece. For endgame artifacts, for Electro Keqing, hands down a 4-piece Thunder Silver set is a must. It has the highest damage output possible. It gives you a 35% damage increase to everything, your auto attacks, your elemental skill, and burst, when enemies are affected by Electro. However, just like how I mentioned about the Lion's Roar before, it does have limitations when enemies can't be affected by Electro, like the animal hypostasis and certain slimes. So the damage bonus doesn't work at all, and your damage becomes very minimal. It's also not very good in co-op when you're mixing a lot of elemental reactions and can sustain an Electro debuff on your enemies. 2-piece Thundering Fury and 2-piece Gladiator is a very balanced set. However, it simply just doesn't do much damage compared to the 4-piece Thunder Silver set. If you are a dedicated Keqing main, I highly recommend keeping this set when you absolutely cannot use your Thunder Silver set. As a 4-piece Thunder Silver set user, I haven't really run into any problems because the set is so strong and I have decent substats, but it's good to keep a backup set. Especially when you do farm for a Thunder Silver set, you will also get Thundering Fury pieces from the same domain, and Gladiator pieces will always be available as well. Since this is the case, you should first start off with 2-piece Thundering Fury and 2-piece Gladiators and work your way up for a 4-piece Thunder Silver set, if you really want to invest in that effort for your Keqing. Now if you use Keqing mainly for her burst and you swap her out often with your team, 2-piece Thundering Fury and 2-piece Noblesse is a decent choice too, especially if you don't want to invest in a 4-piece Thunder Silver set. There were times in the Spire Abyss when I just used Keqing for a burst and swapped out into a DPS more suitable for the respective chambers, so it is a pretty decent set to have on the side, but not worth actively farming for if your Keqing is always on the field. I can't recommend the 4-piece Thundering Fury set because the Electro reactions are just too weak in general. If they ever get buffed, it could become a much more viable set for Keqing. Now for physical Keqing. Go for a 2-piece Bloodstain and 2-piece Gladiators. You'll do a lot of damage with this set paired with superconduct reactions. Since I use an Aquila Favonia, I like to keep a spare set so that I can switch from Electro to physical when I need it in certain Abyss floors and chambers. I also can't recommend the 4-piece Gladiator set because it doesn't buff charge attacks, only normal attacks. For main stats late game, the timepiece you want attack percent, either an Electro or physical damage bonus cup depending on your Keqing playstyle, and for the headpiece, go for crit rate or crit damage, whichever you need more. I'm sure you heard this a million times, but go for the 1:2 crit rate to crit damage ratio. Also, if your weapon has crit rate, use a crit damage headpiece. If your weapon has crit damage, use a crit rate headpiece. Also keep in mind, Keqing's Ascension stat is crit damage, so likely you will favor a crit rate headpiece instead. If you're just starting with farming artifacts, try to strive for at least 50% crit rate and about 130 to 140% crit damage and work your way up. For late game, I recommend hitting a crit rate of about 60% and higher, and crit damage at 160% and higher. For Electro Keqing team comps, I recommend the Hydro support character, an animal character, and any healer for the last slot. Xingqiu is one of the best supports for Keqing. His burst works really well with Keqing's auto attacks, and Electro Charge pairs well with a 4-piece Thunder superset, where the Electro debuff stays. Feel free to use Mona if you have her as well. Animal characters can lower enemies' electro resistance and bring enemies together with crowd control, which is great for Keqing's elemental burst. Feel free to use Sucrose, Jean, or animal main character in this slot. The final slot you can use any healer, but I highly recommend Bennett for the attack buffs. Any cryo healer can work, but I feel like they have much better synergy with physical Keqing with superconduct, but feel free to use them for healing. Also, if you are using the black sword, you might also consider putting a shielder in that slot instead if you really feel like you really don't need a healer. Zhongli is also a very strong pick for Keqing. His shield lowers enemies' elemental resistance, and his burst can petrify enemies, which will allow Keqing to charge spam attacks. Also, if you are using the Summit Shaper, Zhongli is a must. I would put him with Xingqiu or Mona, and then with Jean. Also, if you have Constellation 6 Beidou, I would highly recommend it. With Beidou's 6th Constellation, she can lower enemies' electro resistance by 15% with her elemental burst. I'm not a huge fan of the electro elemental resonance with late game Keqing. Early game it's okay for her burst, but her burst energy cost of 40 is so low, you really don't need it. Paired with her second passive talent giving her the temporary 15% energy recharge buff. But in this team, Beidou can benefit from it. If you want to run 2 DPS units on a team, I highly recommend a second DPS unit that can synergize with Xingqiu, and either Jean or Bennett. With Child, it's best to have Xingqiu at Constellation 2 so that he can lower Hydro resistance on enemies. Pyro DPS units such as Diluc, Klee, and Hu Tao can work too this way. Remember, the support characters are working separately with each DPS, so Xingqiu's working with Diluc like this, and Xingqiu's working with Keqing like this. You'll rarely see any synergies if you run 2 DPS units. I think some people will ask about Ganyu, so if you're running her as DPS, you can use a Melt team with a Wonders Troop set like this, or a Freeze team like this with Ganyu using a 4-piece Blizzard Slayer set. This team favors Ganyu more with the Cryo Resonance. If you want to team up with Fischl, I highly recommend running her as a sub DPS. Support Fischl is decent early mid game as a battery for Keqing, but during late game Keqing does not need more energy to sustain her burst uptime. This is a team that mainly benefits Fischl with Diona's Superconduct. However, Diona's shield does decrease stamina consumption, so it does help Keqing with her charge attacks just a little bit. If you want the team to benefit Keqing more, I recommend switching out Diona with Bennett. If you want a Geo double DPS team, I recommend this team with Zhongli in the last slot. Sorry, I don't have him. If you want a quick swap burst team where everyone just spams their burst, I recommend this team with either Zhongli or Albedo in the last slot. Also, I want to give a quick shout out to Zhangling. I think she's actually very good in Spiral Abyss teams with Keqing for cryo enemies and breaking shields with Overload. I like to use her in Spiral Abyss when I don't need an animal character, so my team would be Keqing, Xingqiu, Zhangling, and Bennett for the additional Pyro Resonance. Now for physical Keqing teams. You want a cryo unit for Superconduct to lower enemies' physical defense, an animal character to bring enemies together, and a healer. You can literally put any cryo character except Chongyun for Superconduct, so Kaya, Diona, and Chi-Chi works too. Remember, Chongyun's elemental skill converts Keqing's attacks to cryo, so he does not work well with Keqing unless you only use her for her burst. I actually prefer Sucrose over Venti in the slot for physical Keqing, since it will be hard to hit enemies in his burst with her auto attacks. So I recommend Sucrose unless you have Constellation 2 Venti, since his elemental skill can lower enemies' physical defense, and you use his burst sparingly. You can also run a freeze team like this. Since freezing enemies allow Keqing to spam charge attacks, it's a no-brainer. Also note that Ganyu is a support role here, with minimal investment. If you don't want a freeze team, you can switch out Xingqiu with Zhongli, and his petrification from his burst helps Keqing spam charge attacks as well. Also, Zhongli's shield will lower enemies' physical resistance with his shield now, so he's very good with physical Keqing. Also, the shield team will be very good with physical Keqing with Zhongli in the last slot. Also, if you have the Summit Shaper, that'll be amazing with this team. Jinyan can give Keqing a 15% physical damage bonus with her shield. If you also have Constellation 4 Jinyan, you can lower physical resistance on enemies by 15%. Diona's first passive gives Keqing, when shielded, 10% decreased stamina consumption. It's not a lot, but it does help a little bit with Keqing's charge attack spam. Now for her Constellations. Constellation 1 gives you additional damage with your elemental skill. If you use it close up on an enemy, it will add 2 instances of AoE Electro damage. If you are far away, it will add 1 additional attack bonus. Constellation 2 will give you elemental particles with her normal and charge attacks when enemies have the Electro debuff on them. Constellation 3 will upgrade her elemental burst by 3 levels. Constellation 4 will give Keqing a 25% attack increase when she does an Electro-related elemental reaction for 10 seconds. In my opinion, this is a pretty good constellation. Constellation 5 will upgrade her elemental skill by 3 levels. Constellation 6 will give Keqing a 6% Electro damage bonus for 8 seconds for doing most of her attacks. In my opinion, I don't think it's worth actively trying to reach Constellation 6 unless you are able to wail for it comfortably. So should you go Electro or Physical? I think the most important thing to answer that question is to choose your preferred playstyle. If you want a more straightforward, no-nonsense playstyle and just want to attack, go for Physical. If you want a more dynamic and agile playstyle, go with Electro. In terms of damage, optimal DPS rotations with Electro Keqing and the right support characters with good elemental synergy, it will outdamage Physical Keqing, with single targets coming very close. Electro has more potential with AoE damage as well. Also, if you do end up getting more constellations for Keqing, it will benefit Electro Keqing a lot more. Both playstyles are solid, so I think ultimately it's up to which playstyle you prefer. Thank you very much for watching my video. I know it was very long, but I wanted to include all the information necessary for any Keqing player. If you liked the video, please make sure to like and subscribe. Also follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/FrenchTutor_. I'll be streaming almost every day if I'm not making videos. Take care now.